And there was a report in the Daily Telegraph which describes the protesters as a tribe of Negroes who were thronging the streets of Southampton. In fact, they were, ordinary white British working class protesters who were protesting against air. But that sense of describing the working class as Negro or black, it wasn't simply a slip of the pen, it was the way that they were seen. The working class was seen as racially distinct in the same way as many now see whites and blacks as racially distinct, as racially inferior.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Global Politics podcast at the end of history. This is BungaCast with Philip Cunliffe. Hello Philip.
Hi, how's it going?
And myself, Alex Hochuli, and George Hortho is away today. But we are delighted to welcome back on the podcast the writer and broadcaster Kenan Malik. Hi, Kenan.
Hi, good to be back on.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on. Kenan was last on in early 2019. That's episode 70, in defense of universalism, which I'd urge you to check out. And actually, shouldn't have been 4 years, shouldn't have left it 4 years before having Kenan back on again. But, time flies. Kenan's the author of a number of books on intellectual history and political thought concerning questions such as race, human nature, multiculturalism, and free speech. The last time Kenan was on, we were talking about migration and borders, but his latest book is on race and racism specifically. He has recently come out with a book which came out last month, Not So Black and White, A History of Race from White Supremacy to Identity Politics, which came out from Hurst. Now, on race and racism specifically, Kenan's authored The Meaning of Race, which came out in 1996, and Strange Fruit, Why Both Sides Are Wrong in the Race Debate in 2008. And then obviously a number of other books which touch on the topic as well. So I wanted to start off, Kenan, by asking you to place this book in the context of your wider work, which I'm sure would be of interest both to those who are familiar with your other books as well as those who aren't. What does the new book seek to address that perhaps the others don't, or how has the world changed in a way since your previous books on race that you felt this new one had to address?
In a sense, both the world has changed and I've learned a lot more. So it's a combination of the two that flows into this book. In one sense, what's at the heart of this book is what I've come increasingly to see as a paradox in contemporary society, which is that we live, on the one hand, in an age in which most societies, there is a moral abhorrence of racism that, albeit that in most, race discrimination, bigotry still disfigures the lives of many. But we also live in an age in which our thinking is saturated with identitarianism, with putting people into racial and ethnic boxes. And the more we despise racial thinking, the more we seem to cling to it. And in a sense, the book is an attempt to answer that question. How do we come to this paradoxical place? By looking at the backstory, the history, because we have a tendency to look at issues and problems and ideas out of context, just as things in themselves. And so rather than look directly at the quest of identity politics now, which I do towards the end of the book, I lead up to it by looking at both the history of race and the history of the struggles against racism and to overcome racial categorization, and in particular how the two intersect, because it seems to me it's in the history of that intersection of how concepts of race and anti-racist struggles have related to each other that we begin to understand the nature of contemporary politics.
You've mentioned in the past, like you've talked a lot about how certain kind of specific events have triggered particular ideas or or books indeed, from Fatwa to Jihad, obviously is very directly connected to everything that happened around Salman Rushdie. Read Alida, and obviously that's still very much with us, given the most recent assassination attempt on him. So I was just curious, was there any specific trigger or event that prompted you to think, I need to address this question?
No particular event in itself. It's more that the question of identity and of identity politics has become so central to the way we think of politics. And I've become, in a way, fed up with the shallowness of a lot of the debate about identity politics, what it is, where it comes from, and kind of the disconnection of contemporary debates from past debates. So, in a way, I'm trying to put contemporary debates in a long history, and to show where it fits in. For instance, the kind of identitarian politics are not new in two senses. On the one hand, what I argue is that the concept of race is the first politics of identity. And so to understand identity politics today, you have to understand the concept of race as a politics of identity, long before we thought of the phrase the politics of identity. But it's also not new, because there have always been identitarian strands within anti-colonial, anti-racist movements, from the Back to Africa movement in the 19th century, Garveyism in the early 20th century, Pan-Africanism, negritude, and so on. But those were largely marginal. There were moments at which they became major issues and attracted attention. But largely they were marginal. It's only in the post-war world that identitarian strands, and particularly in the last 30 years, that identitarian strands of anti-racism have come to dominate. So again, it's a way of understanding why that should be so, rather than simply accepting that this is the way it is.
No, and it's interesting that I guess in the past couple of years, up to a decade, that there's emerged a pole of opposition, maybe not so much to identity politics, but to wokeness. And I want to dedicate some time to discussing that opposition as it exists today, a little bit more towards the end, and actually want to dedicate a fair bit of time to contemporary issues. But before we get there, I think it'd be worth talking about what concerns primarily the first half of the book, which is this theme of how Western history from the 18th through to the 20th century has been one of entanglement of race and inequality on the one hand, and ideas of equality and common humanity on the other, about how Enlightenment modernity and racism seem to emerge in tandem. So could you maybe give us a sense of this history, just to kind of set us up?
Yeah, as you say, modernity, and in particular the post-Enlightenment world, embodies the paradox of being the source both of equality and universality on the one hand, and concepts of race and racial inequalities on the other. To say that race is a modern concept is not to say that prejudices or categorization of distinct human groups were not deeply rooted in the pre-modern world. On the contrary, that notions of difference and inequality and ideas of the inferiority and subhumanity of certain groups were integral to pre-modern consciousness. But that paradoxically is why such prejudices are so different from racial ideas in a modern sense, because only in a world in which the principles of social equality and a common humanity had become accepted, can ideas of inequality, racial inequality and racial difference gain meaning. And that's why we have this paradox of particularly in the post-Enlightenment world, of a world that is both one in which ideas of equality are deeply rooted, and the practice of inequality also deeply rooted, and it's that clash between the ideals of equality and the common humanity and the practice of colonialism, racism, and inequality that is at the heart of the book. Because most people assume that racism emerges when members of one race begin discriminating against members of another, that racism is what develops when races collide. And I argue the opposite, that intellectuals and elites began dividing the world into distinct races to explain and justify differential treatment of certain peoples. The ancestors of today's African Americans were not enslaved because they were black. They were deemed to be black and an distinct inferior race to justify their enslavement. Those kinds of inequalities would have caused little problem little issue in the pre-modern world. But in a world in which equalities become so important, then it becomes important also to justify, explain why such inequalities still exist. What makes that justification necessary is because from the 18th century, America, France, Britain, other European nations began to define themselves by their attachment to equality and liberty. In practice, those policies were denied to much of the population, to much of the world. And race becomes a means to bridge that contradiction by insisting that certain people were by nature unequal and not deserving of equality and liberty. And it wasn't that race was deliberately constructed to explain away enslavement, say, or social inequalities. It was more that as social divisions acquired the status of permanence, so differences presented themselves as if they were natural, not social. And so in that sense, racial ideology is the inevitable product of the persistence of class, rank, peoples, differences of class and rank and peoples in a society that is fundamentally rooted in the concept of equality.
And there's an example in your book, which if I could ask you to discuss a little bit, which I think captures very well how understandings of race have shifted. And it's one which I think would come as a bit of a surprise to many people who, and indeed listeners who might be familiar with the contemporary debates, but not some of the history, which was this episode in Southampton in 1866, where the governor of Jamaica, Edward John Eyre, had been responsible for the slaughter of hundreds or thousands of Jamaicans, and how that polarized opinion. And I think the reactions to that and some of the discussions there are maybe quite illustrative. It's one of the favorite examples that you bring out in the book.
Sure. The event you're talking about was a banquet in honor of Eyre, as you say, in Southampton. To give a bit of background, John Eyre was the governor of Jamaica, and there had been a major revolt, the Moran Bay Rebellion, in Jamaica, in which had been brewing for decades, ever since the abolition of slavery, in fact, because slavery was abolished, but freed slaves were left bereft of any resources, forced to work for the old plantations, for virtually no wages. So it was recasting slavery in the form of a wage labor system. So poverty, brutality, police brutality, all fed into a rebellion, and the Eyre put it down with utmost ferocity. As you say, the numbers killed are disputed, but it's somewhere between several hundreds and a couple of thousand are various figures given. But there was no question about the ferocity and brutality of the response, and the Eyre's actions divided Britain. there were two committees set up, one in support of Eyre, to honour him, and others, and another to opposed to Eyre. And these two different campaigns clashed in Southampton, where there was a banquet in honour of Eyre. And there was a report in the Daily Telegraph which describes the protesters as a tribe of Negroes who were thronging the streets of Southampton. In fact, they were, ordinary white British working class protesters who were protesting against Eyre. But that sense of describing the working class as Negro or black, it wasn't simply a slip of the pen, it was the way that they were seen. The working class was seen as racially distinct in the same way as many now see whites and blacks as racially distinct, as racially inferior. And if you go through much of the discussion of the working class in Britain, and in France in the mid 19th century, you'll find example after example of the working class as seen as being racially inferior, and the middle class writers, intellectuals, raising their hands in horror, saying, how has it happened that we created these races within our nations, which are meant to be advanced and scientific and progressive? And interestingly, the many West Indian planters defended the actions of Eyre and of the brutality against black workers in the Caribbean, on the grounds that they're no different from workers in Britain. This is how we would treat workers in Britain, and therefore what's wrong with treating blacks in Jamaica in the same way? So it's a very different concept of what race is and how races were categorized in the 19th century than we would have today. And when I tell these stories, when I point this out to many people, people kind of are incredulous. They think this must be a metaphor. This can't be the actual way they saw farmhands or factory workers. It was very much the way they saw the working class and the rural poor.
I wanted to probe a bit further at this one of these kind of related contradictions, which is the relationship between or the fact that you have the coexistence of racist ideas with this very well-meaning humanitarian paternalism. And this is something, I know you've addressed, and it arises out of, as you've been discussing, this entanglement of ideas of racial inequality with common humanity. And so, the other element of this that I suppose is important is that over the past 3 decades, as any listener to the pod will know, and anybody in fact will know, that humanitarianism and human rights have become one of the main planks of ruling ideology, to the extent that human rights provide the means by which all sorts of things are justified, from social policy to foreign wars. Now, one thing that you've consistently stressed across your writing, including in the most recent book, is that those who proponents of racial thinking and people who would be understood as out and out racists today were nonetheless often also deeply concerned about humanitarian suffering of those they saw as racially inferior, such as massacres carried out by British imperial administrators. So could you perhaps untangle this kind of apparent conundrum for us? How does racism sit with what appears as benevolent concern?
Yeah, an interesting way to look at it is the distinction between, or the difference between, the way that someone like John Stuart Mill, kind of the lodestone of Victorian liberalism, looked on what came to be called the Indian Mutiny, and the way the Chartists, with the working class radicals, looked on it. Mill was someone who supported colonialism. He worked for the East India Company. And after the mutiny, he wrote a long memorandum in which he set out the reasons for having the East India Company. And he defended colonialism on the grounds that the East India Company had brought all these advances to India, and that made it important. His view, like that of many liberals, was that equality was fine for those who were for advanced peoples, but for peoples that he saw as childish or backward, you needed, in his word, despotism. They needed to be. It wasn't that they were incapable of civilization, but they needed to be shown how to be civilized by the civilized peoples of Europe and America. The Chartists took a very different view. They argued that what the Indian Mutiny was the peoples of India defending or fighting for national sovereignty against foreign rule. And they made the point that just as Britons had supported the Poles against Russia or the Hungarians against Austria, so they should support the Indians against the British. And in a sense, it's what we're seeing are two different strands of universalism, if you like. We talk a lot about universalism, but two different strands. A liberal universalism, which was happy to accept colonialism and some even slavery, and a radical universalism for whom liberty and equality was not the prerogative of a privileged few, but demanded that it belonged to all. And we see that from the Enlightenment right through to today. Those two different ways of understanding, looking at universalism.
So I wanted to ask one final question about, which is a more historical question, before moving on to some of the more contemporary concerns. And one of the things I loved about the book, as I told you when I read an earlier copy of it, was how it wrong-foots the reader at various points, or at least presents historical evidence and a narrative that runs contrary to contemporary understandings. So, in effect, I think the book is very successful in doing what you have set out to do. And one of these concerns, how white identity was constructed and emerged precisely as white supremacy starts to wane, which again is something which runs completely counter to contemporary prejudices.
Well, it's not so much that white identity emerges as white supremacy wanes. It is more that it becomes consolidated at the point at which the huge anxieties were developing about the possibilities of white supremacy. And I think to understand that, you have to look at the intertwined histories of the concept of race and of whiteness. As we've just discussed, the meaning of race was very different in the 19th century than it is today. I mean, we think of race primarily in terms of skin color, continent of origin, black, white, Asian, and so on. Where in the 19th century, as we've discussed, it was a description of social inequality, not just of skin color, and therefore the working class could often be seen as white. And many of the groups that we think of as white today certainly weren't seen as white, or at least were regarded as not quite white in the 19th century. Not just Jews or Slavs or Spaniards or the Irish or the working class. But, for instance, Benjamin Franklin thought that Germans were too swarthy to be white, and he complained about the predominance of Germans in early America. The only group that was unquestionably white was Anglo-Saxon. And so through the 19th century, the meanings and boundaries of whiteness was fiercely contested, and different groups drawn in. Sometimes that were kicked out of what was defined as white. But in the early 20th century, there were three developments, I think, that transformed perceptions of race and whiteness into something recognizable today. The first was the coming of democracy. so that the eventual extension of suffrage to the whole of the adult population was a process in which the view of the working class as racially distinct and racially inferior, which had dominated 19th century elite thinking, slowly faded from public view. The second was the expansion of imperial rule, exemplified by a scramble for Africa, out of which a sharper line was drawn between the white and the non-white world. But this coincided paradoxically with what you're referring to, which was a contradictory trend, which was growing anxieties about white supremacy. Imperialism provided for a sense of racial superiority, but the growing challenge posed by peoples of the empire inevitably created a sense of trepidation and fear. A key moment was the victory of Japan over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which was widely seen as a non-white people defeating in war a white people. And then there was the First World War, which was kind of a global war in those terms of white nations against white nations. The white supremacist, the American white supremacist, Lothrop Stoddard, he worried that white people had previously maintained a united front, and now they were locked in internecine battle, and everybody could see that, and this could only aid the aspirations of non-white peoples. And then there were the struggles of colonial peoples against European and American rule, which particularly took off in the 20s and 30s. And so what developed here is a kind of new kind of white supremacy, rooted not in a sense of superiority, but almost in the terror of that superiority and of the world it had created slipping away. It was the age in which we had worldwide immigration controls, for instance, that they became imposed as a way of keeping non-whites out of the white heartlands, as somebody like Stoddard would say. And it was in this context that white identity became consolidated and racial lines redrawn, so that the groups, the important distinctions now were no longer between Anglo-Saxons and whites, Anglo-Saxons and the Irish or Slavs, but much more between whites, broadly defined, and blacks and browns and yellows, as they still call them, broadly defined. And those became the kind of those major lines, racial lines, became the way that people understood the world.
Right, and I mean today, obviously, advancing the narrative forward, you have the defenders of white identity doing so in the terms of diversity, rather than any sense of supremacy necessarily, or rather, there's obviously an argument about supremacy there, I suppose, or superiority, but it's a much more particularistic vision. But before we get to that, I want to address some of the other ways in which understandings of race have changed, and how, as it comes through in your narrative, it's become unmoored from other social determinants. So unmoored from any linkage with class, with nation and national histories, and maybe even with history itself. And there's an accompanying change, which has been a change in focus from racism to this construct called whiteness, such that we get today something called global whiteness that seems to bear little connection to specific and different social structures and histories. So I'm interested, what is your account of how this notion of whiteness has developed, and maybe even more importantly, why it's developed? What function does it serve?
Yeah, I think you're right that race is seen as something, sui generis, something as a thing in itself and an explanation for everything, but also inexplicable except in its own terms. And I think the main reason for that is what I'd call social pessimism, and a sense of a lack of belief in social transformation. That is it's an important component of explaining not just whiteness, but the rise of identitarian politics. Because it seems to me that a kind of radical form of universalism has to be rooted in belief in social change, in belief that it's possible to overcome the fissures of race and identity, to build movements of solidarity that can radically transform society. But that belief has ebbed over the past half century with the disintegration of wider social movements and radical struggles, the weakening of labour movement organisation, the disintegration of the left. And so people have looked to cling more fiercely to their own identities. They're kind of hunkered down in their own separate cages, their own separate boxes. And the more one hunkers down, the more that box becomes the only way through which to perceive the world. And the more that one's race or identity looms larger in one's consciousness. And that has played an important part, I think, also in the rise of, in the shift from thinking about racism to thinking about whiteness as the problem. And it's been a kind of shift that come about almost unnoticed, but it's almost all talk about racism is now talk about whiteness or white privilege. And again, I think much of that is the product of social pessimism. And if you take a figure like Derek Bell, who's perhaps the most significant founder of what we now call critical race theory, Bell, who was a legal scholar in the late 20th century, he saw racism as permanent and unmovable, that black people would never gain full equality. And he saw that not to accept that fact was to do great mental and emotional harm to African Americans. And Bell's work has been, not many people have heard of him, but his work has been hugely influential through, everyone from Michelle Alexander to Barack Obama quotes and looks to Bell as a figure who kind of laid out the map of racism in America. None of them have been, none of them have tumbled down the well of existential despair as far as Bell, but that pessimism has shaped much of contemporary thinking about race. So somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's perhaps the most influential of contemporary African-American essayists, he likens racism to a natural disaster, like an earthquake or a typhoon. And just as earthquakes and typhoons cannot be stopped by laws or by social movements, neither can racism. And that kind of transforms the whole way we look at anti-racism, because challenging racism while believing it to be ineradicable necessarily shapes the character of anti-racism. So it prompts a shift from campaigns for material change to demands for symbolic gestures and representational fairness. Because if racism is permanent and attempts to eliminate it is futile, then anti-racism becomes little more than a kind of public performance or finger wagging at white people, or at best an attempt to make the unfairness a little less unfair. And in that process, we come to see racism in terms of something that is also ineradicable, whiteness. And it is, so I think the key issue here, both in the rise of identity politics and in the rise of the sense of whiteness as being the source of racism, is the erosion of the old radical universalist movement and that sense of social pessimism. even though people may not say that that's what that they are being pessimistic about possibility of social change, that is what underpins much of our thinking about race and racism today.
Well, I mean, what seems to me particularly perverse about the moment and about the emergence of this discourse on whiteness and this pessimistic attitude to racism is that it's emerged precisely at a moment in time, a moment in the history of capitalism, where the old formal, hard, caste based forms of discrimination have more or less disappeared. And so what remains is kind of informal cultural attitudes, which might be prejudiced, bigoted, and so on, but where racism and for that matter sexism as well and other forms of discrimination don't exist as the social forces that they used to. So I wonder if there's, amongst radicals or supposed radicals, an unwillingness to grapple with the fact that we are now faced with a kind of pure capitalism, a kind of capitalism where there aren't these old kind of feudal-like or caste-like structures to be dismantled in pursuit of political equality, but that the equality we have is real, and it's the equality of the market. It just so happens that it's premised on a very deep economic inequality, but that there's an unwillingness to reckon with that, a sort of attempt to rebuild the old forms of discrimination in a way, at least intellectually, imaginatively, so as to have something to fight.
Yeah, I'd put it slightly differently, which is that I think what's happened is that struggles against political inequality have been detached from struggles against economic inequality. The political and economic have become separated, and we live in a world and in a market system which is far more willing to accede to ideas of political equality than it is of economic equality. So that over the past 40, 50 years, as you say, ideas of or those kinds of raw racial divisions and other forms of political inequality, divisions of political inequality, have not been erased, but they've been reduced, eroded to a large degree. And we talk forever about economic inequality, but nobody thinks we can do anything about it. I mean, that's part of the issue of social pessimism. It's like one of those issues that we think will forever be here. And so, in a sense, capitalism cannot live without economic inequalities. Whether it can live without political inequalities, I think, is an open question. But what we call anti-racism today, diversity in a sense, it's not really anti-racism and does not really eradicate racism. And to a degree, if you look historically, one of the important aspects of racism was that it was a means of disassembling class coalitions, sometimes deliberately. For example, in the with the rise of Jim Crow, which was deliberately introduced in the 1890s, because poor blacks and poor whites had come together to challenge elite rule in the southern states, and that ferocious campaign of anti-black sentiment was developed as a way of and a segregation of blacks from whites, and was developed as a way of breaking up that coalition. So, but more broadly, racism has become a means of not deliberately, but nevertheless become a means of undoing class coalitions. And in that sense, I think it still plays that role today, though in a different way than it would have in the past.
One thing, working on universities, and I imagine you've seen this too, Kenan, in your campus talks and so on. One thing that strikes me is how extraordinary, how extraordinary kind of, at one level, there's a very fantastic kind of, albeit superficial, erudition to the kind of the official anti-racism, in terms of the range of thinkers that they invoke, the kinds of theories that they put forward, and stretching to some genuinely sophisticated kind of thinkers. I mean, I remember how 15 years ago, for instance, maybe 20 years ago, CLR James was very much kind of, the figure that you'd only hear about in fairly kind of limited radical circles. Marxists and Trotskyists might be familiar with the name and so on, and some socialists. But, in the last 5 years or so, I've been amazed to see how far, say, CLR James has become kind of a name that is just kind of common among campus radicals. So I guess what I'm curious about, or I want to push you a bit more on, is how far the kind of these ideas of anti-racism in reproducing racial categories, they serve many of the similar kinds of functions, like you say, of disabling the formation of larger majorities that might be kind of more threatening in material terms or in institutional terms, even by creating these, reifying categories and preventing people from articulating more common concerns. I mean, it strikes me, that there is a logic to it, in as much as it's all of this stuff seems to me, I mean, it's a point I've made before on the podcast, but it's kind of the ideology of the human resources department. It's a way of kind of managing large organizations in which trade unions are either non-existent or cowed and constrained. And this is this kind of ideology of official anti-racism and diversity is just the way of manipulating and organizing contemporary capitalism in a particular kind of institutional setting.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that CLR James has become more popular when the kind of class politics he espoused has become less plausible.
No, indeed, yeah.
And you could say the same about someone like Frantz Fanon. I mean, Fanon was more ambiguous about this than CLR James, but nevertheless, what people take from Fanon is only one aspect of his thought. The more universalist sense of argument that he made is completely put aside when people talk about Fanon. So yes, these kinds of figures become representative of a particular way, but a particular way of looking at race, by actually taking out the really radical, revolutionary aspects of their thought. And yes, in a way, what we have now is that equality has become retranslated as diversity. And that it's as if diversity, achieving diversity somehow achieves equality, and it doesn't. Because you can have a diverse world which is deeply unequal, which is where we're moving to today. And so it's almost, diversity almost becomes an alibi for the failure to achieve equality, and I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
Turning to very contemporary matters, I think, because it's a phenomenon of maybe the past 5 years, 10 years at the most, which is that with accompanying the so-called Great Awakening, you've also seen the emergence of a pole of opposition to it, limited still probably, but one which goes by the name communitarian or post-liberal, as well as various associated sort of ideas and ideologies. And so you're critical in the book of one such thinker, Matt Goodwin, for instance, for his well-known framing of cultural conflict between somewheres and anywheres. And it's a pithy formulation, as you note, but it's also problematic because it erases the radical universalist tradition that you've been defending here, that you defend more generally, and and it erases this tradition, which would be critical of liberal individualism or of the sort of thin cosmopolitanism of the World Economic Forum, effectively those anywheres, and presents the only pole of opposition possible as being the communitarian one. And you're trying to kind of split those apart, or kind of point to a kind of third option there.
Yeah, it's David Goodhart, by the way, the somewheres anywheres
Sorry, I don't
distinction.
know why I said
That could be. What the post-liberal communitarian critique presents is that there is only one way of challenging liberal individualism, and that is through a kind of communitarian viewpoint. And there are two broad problems with that viewpoint. First is that it's not the only way of challenging liberal individualism. I mean, the radical universalist tradition did so, and did so from a very different perspective about the kind of society that we want, in place of one that is atomized or fragmented in a liberal individualistic way. But the other aspect of it is that the post-liberal critique is itself rooted in the politics of identity. The worries about immigration, anxieties about the de-whitening of communities, and so on. And so I think we need to, those of us who are consistent in our critique of the politics of identity, need to challenge not just the openly identitarian politics, but also the hidden identitarian politics of the post-liberal or communitarian critique. And it becomes a real problem because in much of mainstream conservative, as well as in post-liberal thinking, many of the tropes of the far right are represented. The anxieties about whiteness, for instance. Quite often the great replacement theory as a critique of immigration. The great replacement theory being the idea that the elites are using immigration as a means of replacing indigenous populations, indigenous white populations, with pliable migrants, and so on. And in a way, we live in a world where conspiracy theories have a lot more purchase, and in which these kinds of identitarian arguments also have a lot more purchase. And one of the consequences of the left mainstreaming the politics of identity is that it has allowed the far right to rebrand racism as white identity, and many on the post-liberal communitarian milieu have adopted that argument too.
Phil.
Yeah, so just to push you on this point, so you frame the issue in terms of the far right, or it's the way in which certain far right ideas have gained credence, I suppose, in the contemporary context by this kind of inadvertent, I suppose, conspiracy of coincidence between identitarian left on the one hand and post-liberal communitarianism on the other. But I suppose my concern is, that the far right is no meaningful political threat in advanced liberal democracies. And so surely we can't frame our problems in terms of the significance of, a growing kind of fascist menace, or in terms of the far right kind of gaining in electoral strength. Our problems surely are ones that are not those of the threat of a renewed fascist menace.
I'm not arguing about renewed fascist menace. I'm talking about the way that these kinds of arguments have become mainstream. That's the issue. The issue isn't the far right pushing this. The issue are mainstream intellectuals, commentators pushing this. And And the dangers of it you can see in the way that class itself has become racialized. You can see, we talk about the white working class, and when we talk about the white working class, which is not a useful phrase at all, but when we talk about the white working class, it's as if the whiteness matters more than the working class location, so that the problems of the white working class aren't, the problems are to do with the fact that they're working class, have come to be seen as to do with the fact that they are white, and that the notion of class itself then becomes racialized in two ways. One is this idea of attaching whiteness to the working class. The second is to view minorities as belonging to classless communities, that as if class doesn't matter to black people or Asians or any form of minorities. And so what that does is it allows middle class minorities to take center stage in these discussions, and to push the needs and aspirations of working class minorities to the side, so they get marginalized in the same ways as the needs and aspirations of white working class get marginalized. And so rather than seeing this as issues of class, what from both left and right, we racialize those issues, and that to me seems to be the problem. And if you look at a lot of the writings of post-liberals or communitarians, it's there. That's a strand that runs through their thinking, and that's the problem. It's not this kind of, I'm not talking about fascist menace. I'm talking about these ideas becoming central to the way we start thinking about issues of equality and inequality, of diversity, of class, and so on.
All right, excellent. Very good. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We wanted to keep you on to discuss more prospective issues about the role that race may play in future geopolitical conflict and so on, but maybe we'll have to do that another time, Kenan. But thank you very much. I would urge listeners to go out immediately and get a copy of Not So Black and White. It is really excellent. So, and I'm sure that has come across from the conversation we've just had.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure being on again.